So last night, my wife and I were watching some YouTube videos, talking, discussing it being the last day of the last episode of Colbert's The Late Show, the state of American politics and culture and economics and so on, and a lot of it over time, especially. Um, a lot of it was negative. It's just kind of where a lot of us are at. My wife and I were recently looking at land here in northern Arizona, and just about everything we've looked at has fallen through for one reason or another, and things really are or have gotten quite a bit more expensive here, and it's feeling increasingly difficult to really get on a path to true progress if you don't already have money and you don't have a lot of equity and you're trying to grow it. It is incredibly difficult, and it always has been. That's just the nature of life, yes. However, recent generations that are currently alive, especially older ones, such as baby boomers, that get a lot of hate, but admittedly, a lot of it's deserved, as far as I'm concerned. As a millennial, it's a little biased, but I've been told, even by my own parents and grandparents, that I am a victim or engaging with a victim's mindset, a victim of a victim's mindset, right? And suffering from what they consider entitlement, that we should be given these things, and that we millennials had too easy of a childhood collectively, and that we are a soft generation. And what's funny now is that I'm in my late 30s. I have a master's degree. I have a wife. I have several children. We have a home. And yet, we've still never been able to achieve anything close to what my parents and many of their peers did nearly as easily or nearly as quickly. At the same point in my father's life, every single major thing that he achieved at a younger age than I did. And yet, despite actually going further educationally, and despite arguably working more than he did, right? I worked my entire way through my bachelor's and master's degrees while he took time off. And my mom worked full time so he could focus on school full time. But I also went to school full time and worked during that entire process. Something he didn't have to do because my mom could cover rent and basic bills with just her working. Something my wife and I could not pull off. And then there's also all that pesky data that has collected over the years that shows objectively that everything that is required to live, from housing to healthcare to health insurance, child care, which we actually avoid having to pay by the skin of our teeth, and food, etc., right? Just in general, the cost of living, the necessities, your utility bills, just about everything that is important in life has gone up in price faster than inflation, usually, drivers of inflation quite often. Very often, if not always, have gone up dramatically faster than wage growth has. So buying power has demonstrably decreased over decades, notably since the 1970s, really picking up in the 1980s, and then continuing ever since then, with maybe small stops and starts here and there. It's not like it's a straight line. It's a general trend that we've seen over decades that was put in place on purpose and supported by people like my boomer parents and my silenter grandparents, silent generation, that is. And despite the fact that my grandparents and parents had far less expensive college and far less expensive houses, even when adjusted for inflation, adjusted for wages, everything else, less expensive. Their food was less expensive and generally higher quality, with generally fewer preservatives and less nonsense like corn syrup being used as a filling for everything. And despite this demonstrable reality and the fact that all four of my parents' children are telling them and explaining to them how much harder it is to get started in life and have a family in this day and age, than it was for them. What we keep hearing is that they had to work hard too. So we just need to push through it. God will provide. The Lord has a plan, and we need to stop being entitled. Few things have ever made me want to punch somebody in the face as badly as being told that my family and I in particular, and that my wife, that are both working full time, by the way, both working full time in professional jobs with a bachelor's degree or higher, collectively we make over $100,000 a year, and we are still struggling to pay off debt that we accumulated to get the degrees we were told we should get to make this triple or six-digit income to begin with, right? And it increasingly doesn't feel not only not worth it, it really does feel like we were lied to. And then it feels like even not only are older generations struggling to understand and accept this, even if they do, like, they choose not to. There is a cognitive dissonance that is uncomfortable for them. And so they would rather believe that they were just uniquely special and hardworking, despite the fact that I'm sure if you went back, you brought the greatest generation back, those who raised baby boomers, their parents, and asked them if they thought their children were uniquely special or hardworking, we'd probably get a laugh out of a lot of them. Like, no, nope. A lot of them were fucking hippies during the Vietnam War and protesting, and they were countercultural warriors and all this stuff back in the 60s and 70s, and really started the marijuana culture that has grown and developed today into what is largely a legalized framework throughout this country in loose and very disjointed ways. That a lot of that's boomers. Like, millennials helped bring a lot of that to fruition. We've been a continuation of that in many social issues, right? Yet the idea that boomers are somehow special is laughable. Yet the reality that they are incredibly wealthy as a generation and have collectively voted for the benefits that they had as children to not be given to future generations is also demonstrable and factual. And yet, we're told we just need to do more. You need to get even more higher education, or you should have gone into the trades, or you should start your own business. You should have the grit that we had. Like, I'm sorry, my mother was stay at home and my dad was a cop, and they still like slowly collected rentals, but with money that my grandfather was willing to lend them because he defrauded insurance companies as an insurance adjuster himself. So he made kind of an illegitimate small fortune, bankrolled my parents being able to get into real estate, which allowed my mom to stay home. And you know what benefits my wife and I have in that regard? Zero. And so at most you can claim that millennials had a soft childhood, and by no means did all of us, but like I, for example, did have a middle to upper middle class upbringing. It got better over time as my parents collected real estate. So when I was really young, my parents were actually not super well off. We were basically surviving on a cop salary, which it was decent, but not great. And we were like very solidly lower middle class, but by the time I was an adult, we were pretty solidly starting to get into upper middle class, and my parents have just continued growing since then. So that's kind of, ambulance. Hope everybody's okay. Anyway, so while I'm happy for my parents, the reality is they had an artificial leg up. Vast majority of their own generation didn't have. And what's funny enough is that they're not providing it to us either. They've let my wife and I, like in our early marriage, live with them to help save money and so on. But otherwise, we didn't get offered loans. We haven't been bankrolled for real estate. Like, none of that happened. And even if we did, we would require a lot more of it, which is what they keep saying. Like, oh, it's just so expensive to buy in. Like, we couldn't possibly. And if we did it for you, it had to do it for all the others. Like, okay. Like, I'm not expecting you to. I didn't actually even bring it up, so it sounds like, one, that's guilty conscience there. But two, it says something, doesn't it? That you got it without even much of a question. And for your grandfather, or my grandfather, her father, my mother's father, they didn't really even have to think about it. Like, it wasn't even a big deal. Relatively small loans, a family gift. And yet, even by my parents' own admission, that's not what their situation is. They know it is significantly more expensive and more difficult to get started, and they'll speak out of that side of their mouth. But then also turn around and say that we just need to keep our nose at the grindstone, and Trump is fixing everything, and it's an evil cabal that has destroyed much of the economy, but also we're entitled. And so the disjointed, contradictory thoughts is almost mind numbing. And so when my dad entered the conversation last night, while my wife and I were discussing politics, it predictably did not go great. Because we agreed on a few things, like where we came from, because our family is all collectively mostly living in Arizona now, and we all were born and raised in California and moved largely due to how expensive it was getting. And my wife and I couldn't afford homes in the communities we grew up in that my parents were able to buy on a single income, and a one extra single family home that paid them rent and they made a few $100s on per month. That was what they were able to afford a home on in my area of or my childhood region, right, where I grew up, born and raised. And now that home is roughly $800,000 in value, and way outside of the range of what my wife and I are able and willing to afford without bankrupting ourselves otherwise. Even if we could technically qualify, I have no interest in doing that. There's just it's more house than we would need anyway. But that was the goal back then, having a big old friggin' house, right? And so it's an interesting state, because I know that my wife and I, our situation, our family struggles and difficulties, and knowing what our parents and parents' generation and what America was providing and able to do in the 80s, 90s, and 20s versus what we're struggling to barely meet now in the 2020s, and seeing prices just constantly go up way faster than our wage, increases have been climbing, is so remarkably frustrating. And yet to then be told that we're just not doing something right, or we just need to give it more time, or you know what, just your generation is just struggling more than ours, some of it's out of your control, but you're also kind of an entitled generation, you guys were soft, and maybe this will help toughen you guys up, and basically the implication being we need to be brought up to the boomers levels. Okay, all right, so yeah, part of me wants to propose a national day of punch boomers in the face, but you know I think I'd just settle for a revolution that completely overthrew our existing system and started instituting elements of what would often be called democratic socialism, but I would just call friggin' fairness, right? We both need a certain amount of competition reintroduced to the markets, certain amount of decentralization of corporate power, and we need more cooperation among people. As one of the frustrating things about buying land, even here in good old free Arizona, is zoning laws or regulations and requirements make it very difficult to do anything other than have a site-built home. And even in places where you can, like if you buy more than a 2-acre lot, you still need to have a permitted building that has, passed inspection and has electrical hookups and all this stuff. So if you even want to try to live off grid or homestead or what have you, it's still a process that's almost definitely going to require a mortgage and require you being a part of systems that you don't even have an option of opting out of if you want to own. And this is in what is supposedly a pretty red state. And for the record, I myself I don't identify as a red or blue voter. I'm more independent, and view myself as just an anti-current American system voter. That's more how it is. I think American capitalism, as it exists now, is intensely flawed, is intensely corrupt, and needs to change. And I think that part a whole lot of us can agree on. And I think coming to that conclusion is not really difficult in this day and age. if you're living in the 2020s, it's kind of staring you in the face, right? So I think that's non-revelatory for the vast majority of us. No shit, the United States is really getting worse economically for the vast majority of us. That said, think things like balancing. What we need in many of these situations is some form of balancing of power. And right now, we have collectively destroyed much of organized labor's power, unions and associations, workers' associations, and so on. Much of that's gone. Corporations have consolidated and brought together power on an almost unprecedented scale, and then use that power and money that they've accumulated to then effectively buy off our government and then solidify that power even more. And they've been doing this for decades. So, whether one believes or cares about the specifics, while the government is a part of the problem, that is largely a symptom. And balancing things out will involve necessarily, whether it's this government or an entirely different. You could overthrow it and declare it communist. Ultimately, doesn't really matter what you call it. Doesn't really matter if we call ourselves, oh, we've restored capitalist America, or we are now socialist, or we are now communist. Ultimately, what matters is making sure people are taken care of, making sure that people have the ability to progress, right? To feel like they have a stake in our system and in our nation. Making sure people have the ability to move forward, put money away in savings, not live on this debt cycle. Make sure that power, regardless of where it may be concentrated, is kept at bay and balanced out by other loci of power. That may mean, and probably should mean, building unions back up, even if it's different, because they're not perfect either. Making sure that big money and big business is not allowed to influence politics on the same level. Getting rid of a lot of the methods of political corruption and trying to close a lot of those gaps and loopholes in our corrupt tax system. And there's a laundry list of things we can do. And there's a variety of ways we can skin this particular cat, and there's a whole variety of things we can call a new system or a change system or reform. We can even just call it that. The reformed United States. We could write a new constitution and call it, the new American Republic. It doesn't really matter how we go about it, as much as making sure certain key provisions are met. And that is allowing people to actually have hope for their lives, to actually be able to move forward in a positive way, to raise their families with hope that the world and the nation will be better for their children than it was for them. Making sure that we're voting the benefits that we had as children are still in place by the time our kids grow up and when their children grow up, and not repeating these mistakes and falling into the same traps and lies that baby boomers have, that the government and taxes and regulation is the problem. And then when it's staring you in the face that it hasn't been, that it's actually corporate corruption that has led to political corruption that is hurting all of us, they turn to it must be some kind of global cabal, and this was the plan the whole time. But they were part of the plan. They voted for that plan, even if it existed at all. Apparently, it's easier to blame some kind of shadow cult that's drinking children's blood than it is to acknowledge we fucked up. We need to change this. We need to acknowledge that the political system our generation built is broken, that it is corrupted, that it is bleeding many of us dry and allowing the private market, such as it is, to bleed us dry. We are a corporatist maritime empire, is what the United States currently is. That for a long time focused on draining outside nations for America's benefit. And now is really not even ashamed to acknowledge or show that they're draining us in the process. We are just as expendable as any kind of foreign, market that can produce goods for them cheaply. And then China's over here strengthening itself and allowing its people to be exploited is using that in a way that is long term strengthening their nation and their economy and their military and their presence on the world stage, while the United States is diminishing as a nation, almost like mushrooms growing on a log. If the United States is a log, right, we are one whole, complete wooden piece that functions as a unit, then corporations and big corporations are mushrooms, in this analogy, that are slowly covering this log and draining it of its life force. And at a certain point, that log and its resources are going to die. It's going to be gone. I mean, I realize that mushrooms feed on dead logs, so the analogy is not perfect, I realize. But nonetheless, that is to say, corporate America is parasitic and is now getting to a point where it is leeching more than it is giving. And the United States as a whole is having a similar effect on the world. Things are objectively getting worse in that regard. And we need to change it. And if we need to change it violently, then so be it. But we first need to come to terms with what has happened and be realistic with ourselves and not buy into fantasies and fairy tales about there being white hats versus black hats and being some big war behind the scenes and somebody else is going to come and fix it, and a billionaire from New York City who has been involved in the corrupt political machine of that city and state, or his family has been anyway, for several generations now, and it was born with worth several hundred million or tens of millions, and then became a centimillionaire quickly, and was born very much into a silver spoon family, and who's demonstrated nothing but narcissistic tendencies and traits, very much referring to Donald Trump here. Believing that someone like that is going to save us when everything he's done and said would indicate otherwise. Well, in real terms, he may say, I'm going to save the United States, but everything he says in regards to what he's actually going to do to get us there has been nonsense. It's been lies. And I think you do have people that are realizing that increasingly. But nonetheless, it's going to take more of us that wake up, that are angry, and then slowly but surely we put together this realization and this collective effort and willingness to change the system by force, hopefully non-violently, hopefully slowly, but in very secure ways. If we must eject some of these top brass forcefully, then so be it. But the United States needs to change and needs to be reborn. So, anyway, that's all I'll say for today. If you want to continue hearing and discussing such topics as how we make our world and our nation a better place and leave it better for future generations, stick around because we'll be talking about it.